The call came through on a Tuesday at 07:43, and it wasn't for any of the doctors. Spruce Ridge General Hospital's trauma bay had been running at capacity since 6 in the morning. A logging accident north of Kenora had sent 3 workers down the highway in separate ambulances, and the department was still absorbing the aftermath when the radio at the nursing desk crackled with something that didn't belong to any of their usual frequencies. The paramedic dispatcher's voice was tight in the particular way voices got tight when the situation had already outpaced the language available for it. Incoming DART priority transfer. Patient is federal. ETA 9 minutes. They're asking for someone by name. Charge Nurse Patricia Holden looked up from her tablet. Which physician? Not a physician. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. They're asking for Shepherd. The trauma bay went quiet in the way that large, loud spaces sometimes went quiet. Not all at once, but in a wave, one person stopping and then the next, until the only sounds left were the monitors and the distant clatter of someone's cart in the hallway who hadn't heard yet. Joanna Sefton was at the supply cart in the corner. She had been at the supply cart, or one very like it, for the better part of 4 months. She was restocking hemostatic gauze with the methodical attention of someone who had made a private agreement with herself to do every assigned task completely and without complaint, regardless of what the task was. She had become very good at this. She had also, without meaning to, become almost entirely invisible. She set down the gauze. Nobody in that room had called her Shepherd in 11 months. Patricia was already looking at her, not with the expression of someone who had just learned something new, but with the expression of someone whose suspicion had just been confirmed by evidence they hadn't wanted. Drake. Patricia said her last name the way she said most things, efficiently, without decoration. You want to tell me what that means? In a minute, Joanna said. She walked to the trauma bay entrance and looked through the exterior doors toward the helicopter pad on the hospital's north wing. She could already hear them. Heavy rotors, military configuration, 2 aircraft, moving faster than a standard medevac approach. She turned back to the room. I need trauma 2 cleared, she said. And I need someone to get Dr. Abar on the radio right now. Patricia Holden had been charge nurse at Spruce Ridge General for 13 years. In that time, she had managed codes, mass casualties, a small fire in the utility corridor on the 2nd floor, and one extremely confused moose that had wandered through the ambulance bay during a February blizzard. She was not a woman who was easily unsettled, but she had also spent 4 months watching Joanna Sefton restock supply carts. This had been Patricia's decision, which meant it was also Patricia's conscience. New nurses went through a structured orientation that included supply rotation as a foundation. Patricia had extended Joanna's rotation past the standard 6 weeks, then past 8, then past 10, and had told herself each time that it was procedural, that a nurse with a gap in her employment record and a reference file that read like someone had answered questions that hadn't quite been asked deserved the longer runway. She had not asked herself until this morning whether the extended runway had ever been intended to have an end. The helicopters came in low over the tree line, and Patricia watched through the glass as something she'd been comfortable about for 4 months rearranged itself into a shape she didn't recognize. Joanna had come to Spruce Ridge the previous October with 2 things she'd told the hiring coordinator, and 1 thing she hadn't. She told him she had her nursing credentials, current Ontario registration, and 5 years of ER experience at hospitals in 3 provinces. All of this was true. She told him she'd taken 8 months off for personal reasons and was ready to return to full-time work. This was also true, in the way that a sentence can be entirely accurate and still leave out the part that would change how someone heard it. What she hadn't told him was that for the 3 years before those 8 months, she had been an embedded trauma specialist with the Canadian Armed Forces Disaster Assistance Response Team, DART, deployed twice to Haiti, once to the Philippines, and for 8 months to a forward medical station in northern Mali, where the nearest surgical suite had been a 6-hour flight, and the decisions about who could wait and who couldn't had been entirely hers to make. She hadn't told him her call sign either. It wasn't relevant to the job she was applying for, which was floor nursing in a mid-sized hospital in northwestern Ontario, and she had spent a great deal of energy over the preceding 8 months trying to make it less relevant to everything. Spruce Ridge was a town of about 22,000 people situated where the Canadian Shield ran out of patience with the boreal forest, and both of them gave way to the kind of lake-dotted landscape that made people drive 6 hours north on the May-long weekend and then spend the rest of summer trying to justify the investment. It was quiet. It was geographically unlikely to be the site of a mass casualty event. It had a good hospital for its size, a reasonable trauma department, and a charge nurse who ran her unit with the methodical authority of someone who had never been given a reason to do otherwise. Joanna had chosen it deliberately. She had chosen quiet. She had chosen ordinary. She had chosen a one-bedroom apartment near the water, where the loudest thing on most mornings was the ice going out in April, and a neighbor's dog named Biscuit who had opinions about the mail. She had chosen the supply cart in the end, because when Patricia had extended her rotation the first time, Joanna had thought, fine, she needed the slower pace. She needed to remember what it felt like to do a task because it was assigned rather than because someone would die if she didn't. She needed, as her therapist in Ottawa had put it, to rebuild her relationship with normal. She had been rebuilding it for 4 months. She was getting quite good at it. And then the helicopters came. They landed with a precision that had nothing to do with civilian aviation protocol and everything to do with training. 6 soldiers in full tactical kit came through the side doors of the trauma bay before the rotors had stopped, and the effect on the department was immediate and total. Staff pressed back against walls. Someone at the nurse's station dropped a chart. Dr. Ibarra, who had arrived from the surgical floor in the 30 seconds between the radio call and the landing, and who was a man with an unusually high threshold for surprise, went visibly still. The soldier at the front. Early 50s. The specific posture of someone who had been in rooms that mattered and had learned to take up exactly the space the room required. Scanned the bay with the economy of a person who processed environments fast and didn't revisit them. We have a critical patient. Penetrating trauma, right thorax, tension pneumo developing. He's been stable for transport, but the window is closing. He looked at the assembled staff with the direct attention of someone who had already identified what he needed. We need Shepard. Patricia stepped forward. We don't have anyone by that name on staff. We were told Shepard was here. Joanna Sefton, nursing registration number. That's me. Joanna said it from where she'd been standing near the supply cart, which was where she'd been standing when this started and where she'd remained while she assessed the situation, because old habits of position and sightlines didn't disappear just because you'd spent 4 months pretending they had. She walked forward. The soldier, she would learn later his name was Major Castellane, looked at her with an expression she recognized because she'd seen it before, the expression of someone who had been looking for a person and found them in a place that didn't match the story they'd been told about who that person was. You're working supply, he said, not an accusation, an observation trying to understand itself. Right now, I'm working your patient, she said. Talk to me on the way. His name was Warrant Officer Desmond Fairweather, 37 years old, member of a DART advanced team that had been conducting a site assessment 60 kilometers north of Spruce Ridge when a structural collapse had sent a concrete beam through the left side of a temporary shelter. The beam had missed his left side. The rebar that had been attached to it had not. Joanna had the situation in her head before they'd moved him to trauma 2. Right-sided penetrating trauma. The existing field dressing holding but not well. The team's medic, a young woman named Corporal Tran, who was still performing compressions as they ran the gurney through the bay doors, had done solid field work. The improvised tension seal was losing integrity. Tracheal deviation, not pronounced yet, but beginning. He had time, but not much of it. How long from injury to now? Joanna said. 52 minutes, Tran said without stopping compressions. Seal held for the first 30. Started losing around 22 minutes ago. You did well, Joanna said, and she meant it the way she said things when she meant them, without performance. I've got him. She looked at the room. Dr. Malnamin. Ibarra was in the doorway, which was the right place for him to be. Close enough to step in, far enough to not crowd the decision space. Patricia was at the bay entrance with her tablet, which meant she was doing the thing she did in crises, documenting and coordinating simultaneously because someone had to. 2 nurses she knew from the rotation, Kenjiose Mensa, who had been at Spruce Ridge for 3 years and had the stillness of someone who'd absorbed enough emergencies to stop flinching at them, and a newer nurse named Wren Calloway, who was doing the thing new nurses did in their first real crisis, reading the most experienced person in the room instead of the monitors, which was actually the right instinct, even if she didn't know it yet. Needle decompression, Joanna said. 14 gauge, second intercostal, mid-clavicular. Get me the tray. Kenji had it moving before she finished the sentence. She placed the needle. The air rush was audible and immediate. Fairweather's oxygen saturation, which had been dropping in a direction that didn't have a good ending, steadied. He's gonna need a chest tube, she said, and someone needs to get me Dr. Ibarra's best available thoracic. Dr. Ibarra's thoracic, Wren said, and she said it with the slightly apologetic precision of someone who wasn't sure if this was information she should already have been assumed to know. Joanna looked at Ibarra in the doorway. You want in? She said. He was already gloved. They worked for 11 minutes. Not the dramatic 11 minutes of television medicine, which moved in close-ups and meaningful eye contact and music that told you how to feel. The actual 11 minutes, which were loud and specific and required total concentration on a sequence of decisions that didn't pause between themselves to let you catch up. Joanna placed the chest tube. Ibarra assessed the right lung field and called the OR. Kenji ran 2 large-bore IVs and started fluids while Wren read vitals with the focus of someone who had stopped being nervous and started being useful, which happened at different times for different people and couldn't be rushed. When the monitor stabilized, not good yet, but moving in the direction of possible, Joanna stepped back and looked at what had been done and let herself breathe for the first time since the helicopters landed. Fairweather was going to need surgery. He was going to need it in the next hour, but he was alive in a way that had not been certain 15 minutes ago, and that was the work. Good placement, Ibarra said. He said it the way surgeons said things that mattered, economically, without qualifiers, because the precision of it was the compliment. Then he looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't fully read and said more quietly, "You've done this before." "Yes," she said. He nodded once. They moved the gurney. Patricia found her in the hallway outside Trauma 2, where Joanna had stopped to change her gloves and do the particular breathing exercise that her therapist in Ottawa had given her for situations where her nervous system tried to continue an emergency that had already ended. "You're going to need to come to my office," Patricia said. "In a minute. Now, Sefton." Joanna looked at her. Patricia's face had the expression of someone carrying several things in one hand and trying to decide which one to put down first. "My office," Patricia said again, and this time her voice had something in it that wasn't authority. It was closer to discomfort. "Please." The office was small and organized with the thoroughness of a person who had strong opinions about where things belonged. Patricia sat behind her desk and looked at Joanna across it, with the focused attention of someone who had decided to do an uncomfortable thing and was going to do it properly. "Your extension on supply rotation," Patricia said. It wasn't standard probationary procedure. Joanna waited. There were conversations. Patricia set her tablet face down on the desk, which was a thing she did when she wasn't going to pretend the tablet was relevant to what was being said. "Between me and Dr. Richter, about whether someone with a gap in their history was appropriate for patient-facing trauma work until we had a better understanding of," she paused, "of what the gap meant." Dr. Richter, senior ER physician, 12 years at Spruce Ridge. The kind of institutional authority that accumulated gradually and then became invisible because it had always been there. Joanna had noticed, in her first week, that Richter spoke to her differently than to other nurses, not unkindly, with a specific, careful quality that she had read at the time as professional caution and was now reading as something that had made a decision before it had evidence for one. "He was concerned," Patricia said, "about my gap in employment. About what kind of person takes 8 months away from nursing and then shows up in a town like this with a file that nobody can quite read around the edges of." Joanna was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, She could see the helicopter pad. The Dart helicopters were still there. Major Castellane was on a phone call near the tree line, his back to the building, the posture of someone delivering a report. "What kind of person did he decide I was?" she said. Patricia looked at the desk. "He didn't say it in those words." "What words did he use?" A pause. "Liability risk." Joanna absorbed that. The particular quality of being seen as a problem that hadn't happened yet. The preemptive management of a person who hadn't been given a chance to be anything else. "He put it in writing?" she said. "There were emails." Patricia's voice had flattened in the way voices flattened when they were doing the work of staying level. "To me. To HR. I should have." She stopped. "I agreed with him. I want to be clear about that. I extended the rotation because I agreed." "I know," Joanna said. "You knew?" "I know what my file looks like from the outside. I know what a gap in employment history reads as to someone who doesn't have context for it." She kept her voice even, not cold, just accurate. "I was careful about how much context I gave, because I've learned that giving it doesn't always make things clearer. Sometimes it just makes things different." Patricia looked at her for a long time. "What is the context?" she said. Joanna told her what she could. She told her about DART, about the 3 deployments, about the forward medical station in Mali and what it had required of her, and about what the requiring had eventually cost. She told her about the 8 months in Ottawa, which had included a therapist named Dr. Time, Beaumont, who had an office that smelled like old books and who had never rushed her faster than she was willing to go, and several very long walks along the Rideau River at times of day when nobody else was out. She told Patricia that she had come to Spruce Ridge because she needed quiet, because she had been somewhere very loud for a very long time, and she had not yet learned how to modulate the distance between that loudness and everything else. She had needed, as Dr. Beaumont put it, to practice being somewhere that didn't ask everything of her. She did not tell Patricia her call sign. That felt like a thing that still belonged to a context she was not ready to revisit in a charge nurse's office on a Tuesday morning. When she finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Richter's going to want to see your full credentials," she said. "He can have them. He may also want to make this into something formal. An unauthorized intervention." She said it carefully, not defending it, just naming the shape of what was possible. "The patient is alive," Joanna said. "I know that. And the DART team's documentation of the retrieval will include every decision I made from the moment their helicopter landed." She had known this since she'd seen the helmet cameras on Castellane's soldiers. Old habits. The Canadian Armed Forces has a specific protocol for medical interventions conducted by reserve-trained personnel in civilian facilities during active operations. The documentation goes to the civilian facility automatically. Patricia stared at her. "You knew that before you walked to that gurney." "I've been in enough after-action reports to know how the paperwork moves," Joanna said. It wasn't a boast. It was just a fact. "Richter is still going to let him," Joanna said. "And then, because it was true and worth saying, whatever he files, I'm the person who placed that chest tube. That's on record too." Castellane found her in the ambulance bay 20 minutes later. He'd finished his phone call and had the settled look of someone who had delivered a report that landed well. "He's in surgery," he said. "Ibarra says it's going well." Joanna let herself feel that for a moment. The particular specific relief of a patient making it to the OR. "Good," she said. That was all. There was enough. Castellane sat down on the low wall at the edge of the bay with the ease of someone accustomed to waiting in outdoor spaces. He looked at her with the direct attention she remembered from when he'd first come through the bay doors. "Supply," he said. It came out the same way it had earlier. Not quite a question. "Supply rotation," she said. "Standard orientation. For 4 months." She looked at him. "How long have you been looking?" 6 weeks. Your paperwork was clean." He said it with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite frustration. "You didn't use DART contacts for references. You used nurses you'd worked with before your first deployment. I know how trails work. You do." He was quiet for a moment. Fairweather requested you specifically. 3 weeks ago, when the Molly team's medic rotated out and he found out you were somewhere in northern Ontario. He said, Castellani paused, reorganizing. He said if there was going to be a field assessment north of the Shield with no medevac coverage, he wanted Shepherd in the region. Joanna looked at the tree line. The spruce trees up here were a different character than the ones in Molly had been. Darker, denser, more patient. She'd noticed that in her first week. The landscape here had a quality of endurance that was different from crisis. It had been one of the things that helped. He didn't know where I was, she said. No. It took us a while. A pause. We didn't come here to pull you back in. I want to be clear about that. What happened today happened because a man needed specific intervention, and you were the closest person with the skills for it. She absorbed that. The logic of it was clean. It was also the same logic that had been finding her for years, in different rooms and different circumstances. The logic of need meeting capacity, which didn't particularly care what you decided to do with your capacity in the interim. Is he going to be okay? She said. Ibarra's team is good. If the pneumo hadn't been addressed when it was, Castellane stopped. He'll make it through surgery. Then that's what matters. A door opened behind her. Ren Calloway appeared, carrying 2 paper cups with the slightly uncertain efficiency of someone who had decided that doing a useful, tangible thing was better than standing in the break room trying to understand what the morning had been. It's bad, she said, offering a cup to Joanna. The machine needs a filter. I told Patricia last week, but the requisition's apparently sitting somewhere. Thank you, Joanna said. Ren hovered for a moment, then looked at Castellane with the politely determined expression of someone who had made a decision. Does anyone need? She held up the second cup. Castellane accepted it with a sincerity that visibly surprised her. Thank you, genuinely. Ren looked at Joanna. Something had shifted in her face since that morning. The anxious attentiveness of a newer nurse navigating a department she hadn't fully found her footing in had been replaced by something more settled. Not confidence exactly, more like she'd been in a room where things happened at speed and had not fallen down, and was still processing what that meant about her. Richter's looking for you, Ren said quietly. He was at the charge desk asking Patricia for your file. Joanna drank the bad coffee. I know. She told him the file was under administrative review. A pause. I don't think she'd decided to say that until she said it. Joanna looked at the bay doors, then at Castellane. The documentation, she said. How complete is it? Every helmet cam, every radio transmission from the moment we coded the call as a priority medical retrieval. He said it with the particular evenness of a person who had prepared for this conversation before arriving. We also filed the intervention report with the hospital's compliance office 40 minutes ago, standard protocol. Before Richter started asking questions. Before we landed, actually. He looked at her steadily. We didn't come unprepared. Richter found her at 11:20 in the corridor near the supply room, which was where she'd been when he came looking and where she had no particular reason to leave. He was 61, lean, with the unhurried bearing of a man who had operated from a position of unexamined authority long enough that the unexaminedness had become invisible to him. He looked at her blood-stained scrubs and then at the corridor around her with the expression of someone trying to determine the correct frame for a situation that wasn't cooperating. I want to talk about what happened this morning, he said. All right. You performed an intervention without physician authorization on a patient who arrived through non-standard channels during an active. The patient was dying, Joanna said. It wasn't combative. It was just the beginning of the relevant facts. Tension pneumothorax decompensating. The time between the helicopter landing and when I placed the needle was under 3 minutes. Authorization isn't a variable in that timeline. Richter's jaw moved slightly. You're a supply nurse. I'm a registered nurse on supply rotation. My registration doesn't change based on assignment. Your assignment reflects the level of trust this department. My assignment, she said, has been supply rotation for 16 weeks. My probationary orientation ended at 6. She kept her voice even. I'm aware that's not standard. I've been aware for some time. He looked at her in a way that had new information moving through it. Not guilt. Not there yet. Something earlier than guilt. The specific discomfort of a person whose private assessment is encountering public evidence. There are questions about your background, he said. There were, she said. The dark documentation should clarify most of them. A pause. You were a military nurse. Trauma specialist. 3 deployments. She said it the same way she said other factual things. That's the gap in my civilian file. Richter was quiet. The hallway wasn't empty. There were people moving at the far end. The ordinary traffic of a hospital that had not stopped running because one physician was recalibrating something in a corridor. But nobody was close enough to be part of this. The intervention this morning, he said finally. Was it? He stopped. Reorganized. Was there another option? No, she said. He nodded once, looked at the middle distance, then looked back at her with the face of a man who had something to say that he hadn't prepared for. I made an assessment when you arrived, he said, about what a file like yours indicated. I know. I was wrong about what it indicated. It wasn't an apology, it was the thing before an apology. The acknowledgement of the shape of the error before the word for it arrived. She'd seen enough of them to know what it was. Okay, she said. He looked like he'd expected more from that, more resistance, or more forgiveness, or something with more texture than a single word. She didn't have anything more for him. Not yet. Maybe later, once some distance had accumulated and she'd decided what she thought about those 16 weeks. Right now, she had enough to carry. He stepped aside. She walked past him toward the nursing station, and the sound of his footsteps going in the other direction was, in its way, a kind of resolution. Kenji found her between patients that afternoon. Committees talking, he said. He meant the informal committee of people who had been in the trauma bay that morning, and who had been, since then, having the conversations that happened in hospitals after something rearranged the usual furniture. I know, she said. Ren told 3 people that you placed that tube in under 2 minutes. He looked at her steadily. I was timing. It was closer to 90 seconds. She went back to charting. Ren's version is more conservative. Kenji was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been here 3 years. I've seen the supply rotation thing before. When someone new comes in and the department isn't sure about them. Usually it's 6 weeks and then they move up. A pause. I should have said something about that earlier. She looked at him. He wasn't the type for performed regret, which made this land differently than it might have. You're saying it now, she said. Better late. Yeah, she said. It is. Fairweather was out of surgery by 4 in the afternoon. Abar came down to find her himself, which she noted because surgeons didn't usually deliver that kind of information directly. He's in recovery, Abar said. It went cleanly. The field prep you did bought us exactly what we needed. Good, she said. He looked at her for a moment, with the assessing expression she'd noticed in the trauma bay. I've been here 8 years, he said. I've worked with a lot of nurses. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who said things precisely. You should not have been on supply rotation for 4 months. No, she agreed. I'll be at the administrative review tomorrow. He said it as a statement of fact, not a promise of something larger. What happened this morning should be in the record from someone who was in the room. She thanked him. He nodded and went back toward the surgical floor. She watched him go and thought about what it meant that the first person in that hospital to call her by her actual competence level had done so 8 years in. Castellane texted her at 6:30. She was in the parking lot, keys in hand, not quite ready to get in the car. Fairweather wants to see you. Also, something came up in Richter's file, not from here. You need to see it tonight. She stood in the October evening and read the message twice. The spruce trees at the edge of the parking lot were dark against a sky that had gone the particular deep blue of northern Ontario at dusk. The kind of color that had been one of the first things she noticed about this place. She'd driven up from Ottawa on a day like this and pulled over somewhere outside Parry Sound just to look at it. She texted back, on my way. Fairweather's room was dim when she arrived. He was propped against the pillows with the careful posture of someone whose body had recently made a very strong argument and who was taking the lesson seriously. His color was off, which was expected. His eyes were clear, which was the thing that mattered. He looked at her when she came in and something in his face settled. "There she is," he said. "Here I am," she said. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed. "How do you feel?" "Like someone put a chest tube in." "Someone did. You, specifically." He paused. "Tran says you talked to her before you looked at me. Told her she'd done good work." "She had." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Spruce Ridge was going about its evening. Someone was walking a dog along the path by the lake. A light went on in the house across the road from the hospital's north wing. "Your working supply," he said. It came out with a texture she recognized. Not quite disbelief, more like a word trying to understand what it was doing in a sentence. "I was," she said, "in a town like this. It's a good town." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you happy here?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not because it was unwelcome, because it was accurate, aimed at the thing she'd been circling for 4 months without quite looking at directly. "I'm getting there," she said. "I needed somewhere that didn't require everything, for a while. Supply rotation in Spruce Ridge. It was quiet," she said. "I needed quiet." He accepted that the way he accepted most things, directly without negotiating with it. "There's something in Richter's file," he said. "Castellane told me before you got here. From a hospital in Manitoba." Castellane spoke from near the window, where he'd been standing with his arms folded in a way that suggested he'd been turning over how to say this. "Richter worked at a regional hospital in Brandon for 7 years before Spruce Ridge. There was a complaint filed by a nurse named," he checked his phone, "a nurse named Denise O.C. Filed 4 years ago. Joanna went still. She was a trauma nurse," Castellane said. "She flagged a procedure error during a resuscitation. Richter's technique. She was correct. The error was documented in the case review. But instead of acknowledging it, he initiated a process of," he looked at the phone, "of incremental reassignment. Supply room duties. Reduced patient access. An informal competency question raised to administration that was never formally filed, but was enough to create a cloud over her record." "What happened to her?" Joanna said. "She resigned 18 months later, moved back to Ontario." A pause. "Her registration is current, but she's not practicing." Joanna looked at the window. The light across the street had gone off again. Somewhere in the parking lot below, a car started. "He did this before," she said. "It wasn't a question. At minimum, once. Possibly more. Castellane's team has requested Richter's full history from the Manitoba College of Nurses." He looked at her steadily. "What he started with you wasn't a new instinct." She sat with that for a moment. Denise Osei, who had seen something wrong and said so, and had spent 18 months being made smaller for it, and had left. She thought about what those 18 months would have felt like. She thought about what it meant that someone had kept a record. "Who filed the complaint?" she said. "Osei herself. It was reviewed and marked resolved." He said it with the flat precision of someone who understood exactly how much that phrase could cover. Resolved meaning settled, not meaning corrected. "Is she being contacted?" "Castellane's team reached out this afternoon." A pause. "She agreed to speak with the investigating officer. The conversation lasts 2 hours." Joanna looked at Fairweather on his bed, watching her with the steady attention of a man who had been listening to all of this carefully. "What do you want?" he said. She looked at him. "Not what the situation is going to require," he said. "Not what happens to Richter. What do you actually want?" It was the kind of question she'd been working up to for 8 months in Ottawa. "Dr. Term." Beaumont had asked versions of it, always sideways, always approaching from angles that gave her time to move toward it without feeling cornered. She'd gotten better at it. She hadn't finished getting better. "I want to be a nurse," she said. "Here, in a trauma department where I can do the work I was trained for." She paused. "And I want to sleep past 5 in the morning more than twice a week." Fairweather's mouth moved toward something. "That's an honest answer. You asked for one." "I did." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Castelline filed a commendation this afternoon. For this morning's intervention, your name is on DART operational record as the responding specialist who preserved my life during an active retrieval. That's a federal document. It doesn't change based on what any provincial hospital decides about supply rotation." She looked at him. "You have official paper," he said. "Very official paper." Castellane, at the window, was studying the spruce trees with the deliberate neutrality of someone who definitely hadn't personally ensured that particular documentation was filed before the helicopter had fully cooled. "Thank you," she said to the window. Said the window. The administrative review happened the following morning. She wasn't required to be there. Her documentation was complete. The DART files, Ibarra's testimony, Kenji's written statement, which he had produced unprompted and which was characteristically precise. She found out about it in pieces. The way you found out about things in hospitals. Through the particular information network of people who had been near hallways at the right moment. Ren told her that Richter had arrived at the review with his employment record and left with a look she described as the look of someone who'd walked into a room expecting a certain kind of floor and found it wasn't there. Kenji told her that the Manitoba College of Nurses had sent documentation that arrived during the meeting. 2 complaints. OC's was the more detailed. The second had been filed by a paramedic who hadn't been named in the original administrative resolution. Patricia told her herself, in the hallway at around 10 in the morning, with the direct economy of someone who had decided how to do an uncomfortable thing and was doing it. "Richter's been suspended pending review," Patricia said. "The hospital's credentialing committee is looking at his full history." A pause. "OC's complaint has been referred to the Manitoba Nursing Board for retroactive investigation. They've assigned it a 6-month timeline." Joanna thought about 6 months, about the weight of a formal process and how long it ran alongside a life and what it cost the person in the middle of it. She thought about Denise O'Say somewhere in Ontario with a current license she wasn't using, who had said something correct and been dismantled for it over 18 months, and whose complaint had been marked resolved and filed. "She's cooperating with the investigation," Joanna said. Apparently her statement is very thorough. Patricia's voice was careful. She'd been updating it for 3 years. Joanna looked at the window at the end of the hallway. The morning light on the lake was the particular flat gold of October in the north, the kind of light that didn't try to be anything except itself. "And my assignment?" she said. Patricia looked at her for a moment. "There's a trauma support position opening on the day shift. It's been open for 2 months." She paused. "I should have offered it to you when it came up." "You should have," Joanna agreed. "Not combative, just accurate. I know that now." Patricia held her gaze. "I'd like to offer it to you now if you'll take it." Joanna looked at her. Patricia Holden, who had been charge nurse for 13 years and who had run a good department and who had also agreed, without much examination, to keep a qualified nurse on supply rotation because a physician she respected had expressed a concern she hadn't verified. 2 things existing in the same person simultaneously. She was learning to hold that. "Yes," she said. "I'll take it." She saw Richter once more before the formal suspension went into effect. It was in the corridor near the trauma bay, late afternoon, and there was nowhere graceful to route the encounter, so they both simply stopped. He looked like someone who had been doing a great deal of thinking in the short period of time and had arrived somewhere uncomfortable. "The nurse in Brandon," he said. "OC." "I know about her," Joanna said. "I didn't." He stopped. Tried again. "I told myself at the time that she was a competency concern, that I was protecting the department." He looked at the floor. "I've been telling myself that for 4 years." "Did you believe it?" A long pause. "I believed the version I told, which isn't the same thing." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It isn't." He nodded once. He looked like a man standing at the beginning of a reckoning that was going to take considerably longer than one conversation to move through. She didn't have anything else for him. The machinery of the investigation would do what it was going to do, and Denise's statement was already with the board, and her own role in what had happened was documented in enough places that no single person's version of events could overwrite it. She walked back toward the nursing station and didn't look behind her. Fairweather was discharged on Thursday. He walked out on his own, slowly, with the particular deliberate care of someone whose body had recently issued a formal request for respect and who was honoring it. Castellane was there. Tron was there. 2 other members of the advance team had driven down from the site. Ibarra came down from surgical. He shook Fairweather's hand and said something quiet, and Fairweather listened to it with the expression of a man who understood he owed someone something significant, and was still deciding what shape the gratitude should take. Then Ibarra looked at Joanna. "Trauma support starts Monday," he said. It wasn't a question. "Monday," she confirmed. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had filed something in the correct category. Then he went back upstairs. Castellane approached her while Tran and the team were getting Fairweather settled for the drive north to where the transport was waiting. He was carrying something she didn't recognize until he held it out. A subdued patch, slightly worn at one edge, the DART unit insignia. "Fairweather's idea," he said. "He wanted to give it to you himself, but his right arm is in a sling and apparently he can't get into his kit bag." She looked at it in his palm. "You earned it when you were in, and you earned it again yesterday morning," Castellane said. "Both of those are true at the same time." She picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. It always had been. She remembered being surprised by that the first time. How something could carry that much weight in the abstract and weigh almost nothing in the hand. She turned it once, then she put it in her scrub pocket. Fairweather, from his position near the exit, said, "Shepherd." She looked at him. "Don't restock any more shelves." "I'm going to take that as general life advice rather than a criticism of supply chain management." "It's both," he said, and let Tran steer him through the doors. She watched them go. The doors closed behind them. The corridor settled back into its ordinary hospital sounds, and she stood in it for a moment with her hand against the patch in her pocket. Then she turned and walked back toward the trauma bay. 3 weeks later, the formal commendation from the Canadian Armed Forces arrived at Spruce Ridge General, addressed to Joanna Sefton, RN. It cited her role in a dark priority retrieval operation and was copied to the Ontario College of Nurses, to the hospital's administrative office, and to the credentialing committee. Patricia had it framed. Joanna found out about this when she came in on a Wednesday morning, and it was on the wall near the charge desk, between the fire evacuation map and a poster about hand hygiene compliance that someone had written a small editorial note on in purple marker. Wren was at her elbow before Joanna had finished reading it. Patricia asked everyone, Wren said, whether to put it up. Everyone said yes. Everyone? A pause that had the specific shape of 2 absent names. It was unanimous. Joanna looked at the commendation. Her name, in official type, in the place where she had restocked gauze and counted suture kits and been called the new one by people who hadn't bothered with her actual name. She thought about what she had been trying to build for the past year. The smaller life, the quieter version of herself that needed less, demanded less, could exist in a lower register without the noise that had accumulated into something she'd needed to walk away from. She had needed that. She still believed she had needed it, but she also understood now that a shelter was only useful if you were planning to leave it eventually. That the shape you made yourself to survive a hard season wasn't meant to be the permanent shape. That becoming invisible was a strategy, not a destination. She touched the frame once. Briefly, the glass was cold. Then she went to work. The trauma bay that morning had 3 patients waiting, and a 4th incoming. And Kenji was already setting up at Station 1 with the focused efficiency of someone who had stopped registering her as new or uncertain or worth calibrating his expectations around. He handed her a chart without looking up. She read it in the 7 seconds it took to cross the bay, When she pushed the curtain aside and the patient inside, a 44-year-old man, construction accident, right arm, and something underneath the arm that was going to require attention, looked up at her with the expression of a person who is in significant pain and trying very hard to seem otherwise. She looked back at him with the complete undivided attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. "Tell me where it hurts," she said. And she listened. That was the part no one trained you for, and nothing could take away. The quality of attention you brought into the space between a person and their worst moment. The willingness to be fully present there, without shortcuts, without the protective remove of someone performing a role. She had carried it through 3 deployments and 8 months in Ottawa and 4 months of supply rotation in a quiet town in northern Ontario. She had carried it the whole time. It had always been hers.